All right, good morning. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Capitalizing on Strategic Opportunities to Reduce Cheatgrass, Examples from the Field, presented by Brian Mealor from the University of Wyoming and Mike Pellant from the Bureau of Land Management. This is the fourth of 5 webinars in our cheatgrass management series. Oops. There we go. Brought to you in partnership with the USDA NRCS Sagegrass Initiative, the BLM, the Agricultural Research Service, and the Forest Service. All of the past webinars can be found on our project YouTube channel at GB Fire Science. Before I introduce our presenters, I will go over some webinar details. If you have questions or comments for the speakers or me, please type them into the questions window of your control panel located at the top right of your screen at any time during the webinar. I will field your questions for the speakers after the presentation. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio window and check your audio selections. Now I will introduce our presenters. Brian Mealor is the director of the University of Wyoming's Sheridan Research and Extension Center and associate professor in the Department of Plant Sciences. His work focuses on strategic management of invasive species in rangeland ecosystems. Mike Pellant is a retired ecologist, having worked for the Bureau of Land Management for 42 years. He is now a BLM contractor working on a technical reference on land health assessments and targeted livestock grazing to reduce fuels. He is a former principal investigator and current advisory board member for the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. Welcome, Brian and Mike, and thanks for presenting today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Brian, I'm making you the presenter. Great.
Okay, look like it's showing up okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to participate in this series. I spent some time this morning watching some of the other videos from the series, and if you're listening in and you haven't seen those, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at those that have already occurred and those that are coming up soon. This really applied approach to moving the needle, which I think is an interesting title. I'm going to come back to that a little bit, is I think really beneficial to help folks think through what are some of the right ways to move forward. And I'm gonna waffle on a lot of things today, because as I was thinking through trying to consolidate all the different things that I've learned through the years, from partnership with different landowners and land management agencies, from our own research and learning from other researchers, it depends on a lot of things. This idea of success really depends. And so with that, my presentation is going to be a balance of some current research, some past efforts, and then I'll say some kind of common sense observations that we've seen through the years. And like any good scientist, when thinking through something, I will start off by saying that I scoured the best available information prior to putting this together. And I've come up with 2 figures that I think really encapsulate the most important considerations that we should make as far as moving the needle on cheatgrass. And they're highly scientific, but I hope these are the things, if nothing else, that sticks in your minds that you take home with you. So this would be the first. Success. There's many different ways to think about this idea of moving the needle, and this figure kind of made me think of the needle. So it matters where the needle is pointing. So how we define success, I think, really dictates how we approach a project, but I think it's also dependent on the situation that we're dealing with on a specific site or across a landscape or within our own program. And so where the arrow points matters, but then also that pathway to obtain a successful result for a particular project may look completely different than what we think it's going to look like. So that's one highly scientific figure. And here's the next one. Some of you guys may have seen this before. We could go a bunch of different directions with this. I mean, the first question is why, and I think that the why is really important for us to consider when we're thinking about moving the needle on cheatgrass. Why are we thinking about implementing cheatgrass management in our particular management area? The answer is probably going to be for a number of different reasons, and I'll try to frame up those perspectives a little bit as we go through these slides. Another thing that I always like to think about when I put this picture up is that every tool has its limitations. Like, you guys can decide who is the tool in that picture, but in spite of all the different tools that we have available in our toolbox, whether it be targeted grazing, whether it be herbicides, whether it be competitive plant materials, the silver bullet is not there. And in spite of the next unicorn that flies by with rainbows surrounding it, every tool is only going to work in certain situations, and there are other situations in which it's not going to work. And then the other key thing that I think about when I look at this photo is the idea that leverage is important, really important for that guy on the bottom. But when we're thinking about being strategic in how we manage a particularly problematic, widespread invasive species like cheatgrass, identifying leverage points, both from an ecological perspective and an economic perspective, are things that I think we need to really think about. None of us have unlimited funding. None of us have unlimited time. And so seeking opportunities to expand upon the resources that we do have is incredibly important. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more and kind of unpack these ideas. So I'll go ahead and give you guys the punchline. If you want to check out and watch YouTube for the next few minutes, that's fine with me. But so if I encapsulate the way that I think we approach cheatgrass management when working with landowners, I think this is the way that I would sum it up. So successful cheatgrass management depends on employing the right management tactic at the right time in the right place for a sufficient period of time to move toward whatever realistic vegetation goals you have for the site that you're working on. And all the words that are in white there are things that are highly variable. They will depend on the situation in which you're working. They will depend on the lens through which you view your goals for your project. Some of these are largely out of our hands currently, and we're forced to work within the constraints and the biological opportunities that are presented for us. And so I'm gonna unpack this idea and talk about some of the tools that are available to us, and really start off at a large scale landscape perspective, and then kind of start to drill down a little bit into some current research that we're doing, and that we're learning from. And I'll go ahead and say that I'm not going to stand here and be presumptuous to the point that I say I can tell you how to get rid of cheatgrass, because I can't. My hope for this is that you will be able to think through the process and the different variables that affect your success in a way that we literally do move that needle, and it may be incrementally depending on your situation. So start at this big landscape scale, and I'm not going to spend as much time on this as probably that we could. I would say if you'll take a look at some of the existing information that's available online, including some recorded webinars, the idea of applying resistance and resilience concepts across a large spatial scale, primarily tied to sage-grouse habitat with some of these existing publications, it allows us to begin to identify areas that both offer high potential for success from an ecological vegetation response standpoint, largely driven by things like soil moisture and temperature regimes, but also to balance that potential for success with a high potential for impacting, in this case, sage grouse habitat restoration. And whether that's in the western part of the range from this paper, or whether that's in more of the eastern part of the range, understanding where you are in the landscape from a larger spatial scale, and knowing that where you are matters should begin to inform the approaches that you will take. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit, in that it's not just across large areas of the landscape. This was fairly coarse scale, but it begins to matter as you drill down to the specific site. And those processes sometimes operate at different scales. And I'm going to focus in on Wyoming a little bit. If you're not in Wyoming, I think that this could still apply to you. If you look at the northeastern corner, we've largely kind of consider that as moderate resistance and resilience. So resistance to invasive grasses, resilience and the ability to recover following a disturbance. And then I would extend that idea of resilience to the ability to recover following some kind of management actions specifically targeted toward cheatgrass or other invasive species if we move that direction. But so we've also done some more specific work looking at modeling the impact niche of cheatgrass in Wyoming, or the probability of that exceeding greater than 50% cheatgrass cover. Not getting into too many details. The darker the color on this map, the higher the probability of cheatgrass exceeding greater than 50% cover. And you'll see that there's a little bit of disconnect between these two. Most of the northeastern portion shows up as moderate resistance and resilience, whereas for those of us that are in the state, this is one of the worst areas that we see. I don't think that that's necessarily that one of these are right or one of these are wrong. I think that it's a matter of scale and a matter of how we approach these different problems of figuring out where cheatgrass might potentially be a problem. This allows us to then begin think through. So this is not direct occurrence. This represents essentially suitable habitat. So we can start to couple this with targeted surveys to understand whether it actually has reached those levels on a given site, or whether that site is at risk for becoming dominated by cheatgrass in the future. And so our management approaches might change depending on where we are in that invasion curve. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more too. So combining our understanding of where we are in the landscape with an understanding of the invasion process or the weed spread dynamics, or however you want to couch that. I'm going to use this setup several times during this webinar today. As you move from left to right across the top of your screen, basically it's a representation of increasing relative abundance of cheatgrass on the site. So we go from basically a cheatgrass-free sagebrush bunchgrass type community on the far left to essentially a cheatgrass monoculture on the right. It's been documented many times in the literature, not just for cheatgrass, but from some of our other invasive species, that as that abundance, especially relative abundance of a particular invasive species, increases, then if you want to look at whatever those ecosystem goods or services that you're interested in, begin to decrease, and sometimes it's linear, sometimes it's curvilinear. So whether that is forage production, whether it's diversity, whether it's habitat suitability, this relationship is fairly well established. And in an effort to minimize that loss of ecosystem goods or services, being ready to implement management actions early in invasion process is something that we've always talked about as a potential leverage point. I mean, you may work in an area where there are still sites that are suitable for cheatgrass problems that are still relatively clean. And if such is the case, you might be considering more of prevention or maintenance of good habitat to try to continue that resistance and ability to at least limit cheatgrass impact in those areas. Now, if we think about it from a little bit more of sort of a site-based ecological question, some of you have seen these cup and ball diagrams that talk about it's an illustration of different stability domains, or you might call them steady states. So as we move from relatively cheatgrass free toward higher levels of cheatgrass abundance, and I would say that it's typically coupled with some kind of disturbance, there's the potential that the dynamics on that site change. So if we're in a situation where the native perennial species are still largely driving those ecological dynamics, and there's good, there's still maintained some kind of resilience that's there, and good management in place, in the absence of either a change in disturbance regime or some kind of varied patterns of resource opportunities, resource availability, most likely it's going to stay driven by the perennial plants that are there. Now, prolonged drought, repeated wildfires, soil disturbance, all these different things that we sometimes have to deal with, excessive long-term overgrazing at the wrong time, may potentially push that site over an ecological threshold. And that would be dictated by the, or illustrated by the hash line there at the top. Now, once it crosses over a threshold into a stability domain where annual grasses are changing the way that system works, many times we see different nutrient cycling. Sometimes there's been associated changes in soil microbial communities, and repeated wildfire histories where that fire return interval changes. It's much more difficult to move that system back into a desirable, more steady, more stable, more diverse state. And this has been held up many times in the literature. The other thing that's associated with that is I don't think we, in many cases, really know how to consistently do that, to move it back over an ecological threshold in a meaningful and consistent way. So understanding these ecological dynamics may then dictate the management approaches that we take depending on where we are. So again, as we move from left to right, we might be moving from prevention to eradication of new source populations in areas where it doesn't currently exist. After we cross over a threshold, we think typically in terms of long-term management, and you're moving more into a restoration project than you are simply a weed management project. And the cost associated with that and the probability of success highly changes. So another potential leverage point is, can you aggressively manage cheatgrass expansion prior to crossing over a threshold? It's a great idea. I think that we would like to do that. I don't think that our understanding about threshold dynamics and rangeland systems exists to the point where we can say we're approaching a threshold and it's time to implement that aggressive management. I think there's some proxies that we can use, and I think some of those are already out there as far as densities of perennial bunch grasses, or the situation that I think of that's probably may or may not be an ecological threshold is where you have an existing sagebrush community with a cheatgrass understory that's potentially one lightning strike away from losing your big sagebrush and shifting that from a shrub-dominated community to an annual grass-driven system. So understanding the ecology of the system, I think, helps us start to think through where we are in that process, and then start to select not only management tools, but management approaches that are particularly suitable for our situation. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about particular tools today. As I said earlier, I think that every tool has its limitations. We've done a lot of work through the years with things like this. Herbicide trials, we learn a lot from doing replicated trials across a pretty broad region. And as you can see from this picture, there's about 6 different herbicides in these plots, and the green is largely native perennial grasses that are responding after effectively removing cheatgrass with herbicides. Herbicides are not the only option. If you were able to see Tom Monaco's presentation previously, there's a lot of indication that shows that they're one of our tools that are relatively consistent. The key that I think is being able to shift the balance from cheatgrass toward those desirable perennial plants that we want to have on the site. Now, hopefully, there's enough recovery potential on that site that simply removing the competitive suppression of the cheatgrass allows those desirable perennials to recover, expand, and start to recapture that site. And we'll touch on that a little bit more. But we've done a lot of these around the country. And you can see here, you can release non-treated on the right, treated on the left. You can really get sometimes good control and release some of those perennial species. Another example from another site, like I said, I'm not really going to go into detail, but here we're in sort of the transitional northern mixed prairie where we're getting great cheatgrass control and releasing perennial grasses. Again, another situation like that. So one of the things that this generated, as far as in our research group, and I think others have really asked the same question, is if you, from a landowner perspective, if you start to think through this from not just from an ecological side, but couple that with really an economic benefit, does it start to change the way that we look at things? So I'm gonna go through that same set of progression of increasingly worse cheatgrass, and frame it up in a little bit different way. And I'm gonna give a lot of credit to Clay Wood, who's a graduate student working on this line of research now, to this concept and how we're moving forward with it. So as we increase in the amount of, especially the relative amount of cheatgrass that's on a site relative to the perennial grasses is what we're largely focusing on. After a successful treatment, we would expect to see a release of the perennial plants that are on that site, both from a productivity and hopefully from a cover standpoint, if there is sufficient cheatgrass to be that they are suppressing the growth of those perennial grasses prior to treatment. And so there's a point somewhere where if we go out to a cheatgrass infested site and we implement a successful treatment that removes cheatgrass or reduces cheatgrass competition, that we will potentially begin to see an increase in perennial grasses. I'm going to focus more on production from grazing or wildlife forage standpoint. Now, below that point, there's not enough cheatgrass on the site that it is potentially worthwhile from a cost-benefit standpoint to implement a treatment, because we may not see that kind of return. Now, we could also think about this in terms of diversity or other things as well. Now, we're also going to maximize that. An economist would probably call this something different, point of diminishing returns or maximum response threshold. There's some point where our benefit of a treatment on a site just from removing cheatgrass competitive suppression begins to diminish. And that's earlier, that's when I started talking about more of a restoration standpoint. And so we're just beginning to understand how these different points potentially play out across the landscape. We were curious about this, and so we went back and started looking at some of the data just from different trials that we had around the state of Wyoming. And so pre-treatment cheatgrass to perennial grass ratio across the bottom. The reason that we're thinking about going with ratios, this was biomass ratio, is that potentially it standardizes across ecological sites. We're not there yet. This is ongoing research. But we saw, if we looked at the increase in perennial grass biomass following treatment, we saw that there is this curve that exists. This is a limited sample size, and we're going to continue to work on this. But that relationship, there is some evidence to support that relationship definitely exists from a cost-benefit type standpoint. Then, so Clay went and did some large-scale aerial applications at a number of different sites. And here we've got a post-treatment change in perennial grasses as the response variable, perennial grass biomass, and across the x-axis, that cheatgrass to native perennial grass cover ratio prior to treatment. So this would be analogous to going out, doing a site assessment on an area that you know you're going to do some work and trying to estimate what kind of recovery potential you have. So you see a lot of our points are clustered kind of on that low end because we were working in areas where there wasn't a huge amount of cheatgrass. But the pattern appears that it's going to hold. And so the challenge moving forward is to figure out how we can then start to understand how this applies across the landscape, and then use this to then start attaching some kind of cost-benefit ratio or cost-benefit numbers to areas that we know that are already impacted by cheatgrass from a competitive suppression standpoint. So I'm going to summarize, and hopefully I don't know what kind of interaction that we expect to get on this. So hopefully there's going to be sufficient time and engagement for discussion here toward the end. But I think it's incredibly important to have realistic goals about project success. I think sometimes, especially as weed science people, we start to tend to lean toward thinking that eradication on a particular site is the goal, and I don't think that's always a realistic goal. I don't think it's always the goal that is appropriate for a site. It may be more minimizing the impacts and being able to still provide some level of ecosystem goods and services that site can provide us with. I would say seek leverage opportunities. If you're in an area that you think may be at risk of converting from sort of a relatively degraded site into something where the entire dynamics of the system have changed, to me, that really makes sense as a good place to invest some time and effort. And those tools, the landscape scale tools like the R&R framework, can help us start to understand where those things exist across the landscape. And then at the individual site level, I think it's not only important to understand the dynamics of that site from an ecological site description or state and transition model framework, but also go out and do some pre-treatment monitoring and see what kind of recovery potential exists, and whether you're actually dealing with a restoration project, or if you have the opportunity to see some kind of natural recruitment and increase in those perennial grasses that are on the site. And I think you'd be surprised. If you've never, my guess is if you're on this webinar, you probably have, but if you have not taken the time to go out and dig through some of those dense cheatgrass stands and get your face down in there next to the soil, there are perennial grasses many times, or perennial species that are there, but they're suppressed. And so understanding that site potential before you really commit to your project or commit to your management approach is important. And then think through both financial and non-financial costs and benefits. to your project. And I think about non-financial benefits that aren't directly market value type benefits. So we're particularly interested in the increase in perennial grass production, and then how that perennial grass maintains its quality throughout the year in a different way than does something like cheatgrass. But there are other things, diversity, indirect habitat benefits that people may or may not consider when they're putting a project together. And then I'm sure Mike could probably touch on a lot of these things better than I could, but I think you've got to be committed. And I think this is a thing that we really need to accept as far as a lesson from working in the field, is that a long-term commitment, both from implementing direct cheatgrass management actions, but also thinking about how is that site managed over the long term after some kind of treatment, whatever that treatment may be, is implemented. I think that's really the key to moving things forward from a cheatgrass standpoint. And I think that's that has so many different layers tied into it: funding, personnel change. But that's one of those. I mean, it's a non-scientific lesson, but it's definitely a lesson from the field that I think that we've learned. So, in the interest of not taking up too much time, I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and hopefully we can expand on some of those things. So that's my contact information, and I will pass control of the screen back. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Brian. And now, Mike, I'm making you the presenter.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll get this show going. Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to talk about today are really two opportunities to reduce cheatgrass. One in areas where we have cheatgrass die-offs. I'll explain what that is and what those opportunities are. And then I think one of our most opportune times to address cheatgrass is in a post-wildfire environment, simply because it's one of the few times we have funding to actually implement on-the-ground treatments. So we'll start off on the die-off areas. And 2010, BLM developed a strategy to address cheatgrass die-off in the northern Great Basin, following some significant die-off events in 2009 and concerned by some of our local offices in terms of the potential impacts and then what's going to happen in the future. So we put together an integrated cheatgrass die-off project under the auspices of the Great Basin Restoration Initiative. I want to recognize Don Major, who's currently the fire and landscape ecologist at the BLM's Idaho State Office, was a coordinator for this project and did a really good job working with researchers, not only as a coordinator, but also as a participant in these projects. So what we looked at was, or questions we want answered was, where and how often do these die-offs occur? What's causing the die-offs? And then, given that there is an open seedbed, so to speak, without cheatgrass, are there opportunities for restoration? So one of the first things we did was fund a helicopter survey in the Winnemucca area, where kind of was the epicenter of cheatgrass die-off. And they identified roughly 265,000 acres of cheatgrass die-off areas in 2010, just kind of further documenting the need to address this phenomenon, as there were some impacts in terms of livestock grazing, concerns about weed entry, and also soil erosion. So this was kind of step one. Step two was involving our partners, and with this effort looking at mapping die-off areas. We had a group led by Stephen Boyd of USGS, which used satellite imagery from the MODIS platform looking at cheatgrass die-off in the Great Basin. And then a second effort led by Peter Weisberg out of University of Nevada, Reno, that took the Landsat imagery going back 30 plus years and was able to identify die-off events in the past, which proved to be pretty informative about how the problem has evolved and where we are today. So at this point, I shamelessly asked Peter for some slides to address this. I will say right now, what we are talking about is I'm just giving a real quick kind of a broad brush approach to this issue, is putting together a webinar, or maybe several webinars this fall that really gets into the detail of this phenomenon, as well as some of the research that's going on as well. So we had a good set of partners, as you can see from this slide, looking at these three questions that I previously discussed. So I'm just going to quickly give you a couple of examples from each of these questions. This is some work that Peter and his collaborators worked on in the Winnemucca area. Shows die-off areas where it's occurred one time in the past 30 plus years in the light blue. And then, as you can see, going up into some areas where there were 6 or more die-off episodes over the same period of time. So there are hot spots in terms of where die-off is occurring in the Great Basin, especially in this Winnemucca area. And in visiting with Peter, there are some potential future opportunities, because this is based on Landsat imagery, to get some early indications of where these die-off areas may occur. And obviously that would be of great help in terms of managing land, in terms of livestock use, erosion potential. Where we have die-offs, obviously we have a lot less fuels, but then also identifying a little earlier where we might have some restoration opportunities and look to get some funding. So I'm just going to, again, kind of quickly go through these three questions. The cause, this Peter calls the fungal pathogen, the rogues gallery. A lot of this work, Susan Meyer out of the Shrub Sciences Lab in Provo has been kind of a lead in terms of a lot of these fungal pathogens. And the bottom line is it's not a single pathogen. It's probably a combination of some of the ones shown on this slide that interact to affect cheatgrass differently, but to cause some of the issues with the die-off. Having said that, there's really a big factor in this is climate. And looking at back through some of the Landsat imagery, comparing with precipitation patterns, where there was a winter drought that followed multiple years of low precipitation, really seemed to dispose areas to the cheatgrass die-off. And part of that could be because of reduced litter accumulation. Then also that mix of pathogens, the population levels, the relative proportion of the different pathogens, potentially all combined into kind of that perfect storm of where we get these larger die-off areas, as shown in the bottom photograph here. So the last question, are die-offs a restoration opportunity? This is based on some work that Owen Bauman did in, well, over a number of years, working with Susan Meyer, as well as then kind of getting out and looking at the restoration potential in these areas. So this is from an article that was just published in Rangelands here at the end of last year. But what it shows on these upper levels are die-off areas within the dashed lines. The white squares within it represent the areas where the treatments, seeding treatments were applied. And then the control areas are non-die-off areas outside where, again, the same treatment, seeding treatments were applied. And the bottom row of photos just kind of gives you a feel for the die-off versus the areas where cheatgrass die-off had not occurred, where these studies were done. Kind of the take-home message here, the forbs and the shrubs that were planted basically didn't have much response, much germination. However, the two perennial native grasses, bottlebrush squirreltail and sandberg bluegrass, did. And so Owen's study looked primarily at the effectiveness of these two species in both the die-off and the non-die-off areas. So take-home message here, these two native grass species had a 280% more first-year establishment in die-off areas where seeding was done compared to seeding into the controls, which were the cheatgrass areas where die-off didn't occur. And kind of an interesting sidebar to this, they looked at two different seeding rates from 21 to 42 pure live seeds per square foot, and the heavier seeding rate significantly increased this native grass establishment, kind of pointing to, you know, maybe our old standards of 10 to 12 pounds per acre. We might be more successful if we had a higher seeding rate in these cheatgrass die-off areas. So, one quick, I guess, again, some photos from the Rangelands article, just showing on the left the die-off area where the sandbergs and the bottlebrush squirreltail established much better than in the controls shown on the right. So to answer the question, yes, there are restoration opportunities in these die-off areas. We can get native perennial, especially grasses, established, and over time, potentially then convert these areas from near monocultures of cheatgrass to a native plant community that at least has some of the components in terms of the perennial grasses. I'll just close on this part with my big concern, and that is this idea of tipping points relative to climate change, where it may not take too much of an additional increase in temperature or some other climate variable that can result in major changes to the affected systems. And I see a lot of opportunity in cheatgrass die-off areas with restoration, as long as the scale of it is something that we have the funds and the ability to do the restoration in. My concern is if we move from hundreds of thousands of acres of die-off in the Great Basin to millions of acres, and these die-offs typically are only occur for a year, although some, you know, stay in place for 2 years. But if we start getting a longer period of time where these areas have the die-off, then we may have an ecological situation that's beyond the scale of our ability to cope with restoration. And we could see some pretty extensive effects, not only to the ecological, but to the human communities that depend on these areas as well. So I'm going to leave that and go into opportunities to reduce cheatgrass in a post-fire environment. And I think it's a bit ironic that the one program that we get funding to do most of our on-the-ground restoration or rehabilitation work is the post-fire rehabilitation program in the agencies. But we're really dealing with a highly altered landscape in terms of clues as to what we should do. Should we seed, not seed? If we have cheatgrass, should we apply an herbicide before we seed? We have a kind of a clean slate and a very difficult situation then to make these decisions. So I want to briefly kind of go through a tool, and that tool is a field guide that we've developed to look at post-fire wildlife or wildfire recovery potential in sagebrush, pinyon, juniper ecosystems in the Great Basin. And really what we're doing here is, this is a diagram out of that field guide, kind of a decision matrix. On the y-axis, we have fire severity from high at the bottom to low fire severity at the top of the chart. And across the bottom, then areas on the left where we have high perennial herbaceous cover, low cheatgrass density to the left, and then moving to the right, we have low perennial herbaceous cover, high cheatgrass density. In kind of these situations, if we look in the upper left where we have don't seed, allow recovery, we're basically dealing with communities that have a sufficient understory that they have a higher resistance and resilience, the ability to recover, just simply because of the amount of perennial bunch grasses in this particular example. So this situation, do we know this? This is a place where we wouldn't want to waste valuable resources being seed and energy to put that seed in the ground and do rehabilitation. If we look on the upper right, we have another situation where we have low fire severity, but we also have low perennial herbaceous cover and high cheatgrass density, kind of illustrated in this side where we have a kind of a spotty patch of sagebrush with a lot of cheatgrass in the understory. Again, in this situation, the fire intensity isn't such that we would expect a lot of the seed reserve of cheatgrass to be destroyed. So we got to make a decision. Do we just let this go, or do we apply an herbicide, control the cheatgrass, and then do the seeding? In the last scenario, then on the bottom where we have a high sagebrush cover, again, because of that fire severity, we can basically cook a lot of the cheatgrass seeds that are in the understory, and we have a 1-year window of opportunity to go in and reseed with desirable species. So these are somewhat clear areas. You see in the middle, we have this yellow area where it's really much more difficult to make these decisions. And that's where I think this field guide can provide a lot of assistance to do that. So in the field guide, we've identified 6 different or primary components of what we need to do in terms of evaluate an area after a fire, and the terms of and what types of management actions we might want to apply as a result of the fire. So I'm just going to go through a couple of these to just provide you with a few tools that I think help to make this decision. Now, having said that, we have a score sheet as part of this field guide that kind of goes through all of these criteria, allows you to rate it, come up with a numerical rating that's going to try to get you in the ballpark of should you seed, should you not seed. But anyway, here's I think this idea of resistance to invasive annual grasses and resilience after disturbance, especially wildfires. Brian talked about this in his presentation, the soil moisture and temperature regimes. So if we look at this diagram, the brighter red and yellow are all areas that have less resistance and resilience because they are in warmer, drier soil moisture temperature regimes. The blue, dark blue areas have higher resistance and resilience because they are in more cool or more of a cool and moist soil moisture, soil temperature regime. So I'm just going to throw up 2 polygons here and ask, given this situation, what type of post-fire rehabilitation decisions we would make looking at this. I think it's obvious the fire perimeter on the right, a high level of the red, which indicates more warm and dry, which is lower resistance and resilience, so less potential for recovery. Whereas the polygon on the left, a higher proportion of the light blue, dark blue, which indicates higher resistance and resilience, and more of a cool and moist in terms of soil moisture and temperature. So obviously there's a lot more to planning fire rehab and whether we seed or not, but with these large landscape level fires we have now, I think this is a good tool to do some initial sorting on the potential for recovery. One tool just mentioned, probably many of you have used the web soil survey, but just to point out, there is a resistance and resilience soils report. And I think it's one of the best summaries in web soil survey because it gives you information on your setting, the map unit composition in terms of the soils, what kind of taxonomic classification you're in, a typical profile, and then also information on what ecological site. So I'd really encourage you to use this particular report, especially in the post-fire rehabilitation projects that you're working on. The second example is just current vegetation and wildfire severity. There's a lot of ways to get at current vegetation. We have wildfire severity mapping. I'm just going to kind of throw out one example, and that's a fairly new product, a Sagebrush cover class current, which allows us to look at current vegetation and fire severity. So this is the website, a lot of good information. You can pull down these resources from that website. I'm just going to show you a screenshot, and this is one thing about this. It's not just mapping what kind of vegetation's out there, it's also identifying the cover classes. So for this example, the red areas are less than 5% sagebrush cover, yellow 5 to 15%, green 15 to 25%, and so forth. So this gives us an opportunity in terms of fire severity. Remember, the higher the sagebrush cover, especially if we have cheatgrass in the understory, we get a more complete burn in terms of killing the surface cheatgrass seed. So again, I'll just throw up a couple of fire polygons, and the one on the right, again, in areas with less than 5 or 5 to 15% sagebrush cover. All things being equal, we probably wouldn't have the same kind of fire severity and damage to the cheatgrass seed reserve as we would if we look over into the left polygon that has a higher concentration of the light blue, some dark blue, green, which is 15% and more sagebrush cover. So again, just a way to look at that landscape with these tools and make a more informed decision. I might also mention that this particular GIS information, there's also an annual herbaceous cover layer. So you can get a feel for the relative amount of understory of cheatgrass and other annual herbaceous species. So I think if we put these two together, our resistance and resilience and our sagebrush cover classes, along with annual herbaceous cover layer integrated that, it's going to give us a pretty good picture, at least as a starting point, of where we should do seeding, where we would have a cheatgrass problem, where we might have to do control before seeding. So I'll just kind of close with kind of a more to come slide. There is one field workshop that the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange is sponsoring this summer in Winnemucca, June 21st. Rick Mealor will be doing that. So if you're in that area, or even if you're not, strongly encourage you to participate. We will be developing a resistance and resilience applications training course through the BLM's National Training Center. So we're kind of in the process of putting a cadre together to do that. And as I mentioned before, plan on looking for some webinars this fall on the cheatgrass die-off. So my bonus slides real quickly, targeted grazing. Kirk Davies did a great job talking about dormant season grazing. We've got a component of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange on targeted grazing where right now it has scientific literature where we've been trying to gather that. We're also developing a targeted grazing guidebook, more like a resource center. And then we have several demonstration areas, and we're going to incorporate lessons learned. My last two slides, these demonstration areas, one in Elko. This is a 26-mile long contiguous fuel break in cheatgrass dominated areas, which is livestock are controlled more by fencing and water within these linear pastures. So we're evaluating that. We have ARS, Dr. Pat Clark out of Boise is doing some pretty extensive monitoring on this project, as well as one associated with a soda fire demonstration project. This one is more managing livestock with water and supplements and herding with less fencing. So again, we're looking at a strategic approach to do fuel breaks with targeted grazing. So I just wanted to alert you of the resource on the website, as well as a couple of projects, and we will be doing more demonstration areas in the future. And I will end with that. I know we're getting close to the end of the session, so Jeannie, we'll turn it back to you and see if we have time for any questions.
Great, thanks, Mike. Yes, we do. If you have questions for Brian or Mike, please type them into the questions window of your control panel at the top right of your screen. The first question, what is the long-term strategy to maintain low cheatgrass cover on lands treated for cheatgrass and or seeded with native perennial bunch grasses?
You want to take a crack at that, Brian?
I'm trying to think. So my guess is it varies. I'm trying to think through the different levels of variation. So from a large scale process, I think in some ways that's going to be defined by federal agencies when it comes down to federal lands. I think we would say that the approach would be to try to manage appropriate levels of grazing, and then to maintain a disturbance regime of which grazing is a part of that that will continue to maintain the sustainability, the health, the root growth, the ability to regenerate from seed of those desirable perennials, rather than shifting the competitive balance back to cheatgrass. And I mean, at the risk of just waffling, I'm gonna say it would probably depend on the situation what that looks like. But I think too little disturbance in some cases, or too little complete protection from grazing. We've seen sites go to complete cheatgrass dominance. Too much disturbance, I think we've seen sites go to cheatgrass dominance. And so appropriately maintaining a sustainable approach from a disturbance standpoint, and then maybe successive follow-ups with herbicides to potentially keep that seed bank and those seed inputs back into that system at low levels would be long term. I mean, ideally, we would be able to fully deplete the seed bank, the soil seed bank, to where cheatgrass would not come back into that site. Right now, across large spatial scales, I don't think that's a reality. So, Mike, you probably have something to add, if I had to guess.
No, good. I agree with everything you said, Brian. One thing I would add is, remember Kirk Davies' presentation on the dormant season grazing, and I think in many of these situations, just changing the season of use of the grazing, if it's feasible, given the landowner or the permittee, may provide some longer term stability in terms of managing cheatgrass and favoring the perennial vegetation that's out there. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you both. Next question, can we see the web address again for the new veg shrub cover GIS data set from Mike, from your presentation towards the end?
You bet. Oops. We go just a little further. There we go. Yeah, it looks like mrlc.gov.
Great, thank you. And while we're waiting for, if there are more questions coming in, while we're waiting for people to type, I actually had a question, Brian, about the perennial bunch grass percent versus the ratio of cheatgrass to natives graph that you showed. And maybe it's just me, but my brain got stuck on why, if the ratio of cheatgrass to natives is increasing, why you get the cost benefit bell curve. Why isn't it just linear?
Yeah, it's completely counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
And you would think that it might go the other way. So if you're, and without pulling it up, I'm going to try to describe it verbally. So if you're on the left, way over to the left where there's no cheatgrass, and you implement some kind of treatment, because if you're doing like these big treatments across a landscape, you're going to have variability in cheatgrass within your treatment polygons. There's not sufficient cheatgrass competition to suppress the growth of perennial grasses, and so that's why it's low there, especially if we're looking. So that y-axis is percent increase in perennial grass biomass production.
Okay.
Okay, so it's based on pre-treatment levels, so it's not absolute biomass. Although we've got some stuff looking at absolute biomass, and it's not necessarily a straight line either. So that's if you went out and looked. You've got to have enough cheatgrass before treatment to where it's suppressing perennial grass production to actually see a meaningful increase in perennial grass production, right?
Yeah, okay.
And then when you get way out on the right-hand side of the curve, in the absence of reseeding, there's just no perennial plants to recover. And so you don't see a meaningful increase in perennial grass production because the site recovery potential that's just there naturally, there is none. If you get a good control on your cheatgrass, you're left with bare ground unless you start to reseed.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you so much. I was stuck on that.
And I rushed through that. We usually spend a lot more time talking about it, but in 15 minutes, I did the best I could.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions at the moment, but if you're still typing, please continue to do so. But in case that's the last question, thank you all for your participation. And please join us for the next webinar, Ecologically Based Invasive Plant Management for Reducing Cheatgrass, Lessons Learned from Area-Wide Demonstration Projects with Roger Sheely on May 9th. And I also wanted to let you know it's not part of this cheatgrass management series, but we'll also be hosting a webinar on performing quality straw inspections on May 7th. And both of those are on our website if you want to register for those. All right, we would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey that will appear after this webinar has ended. I will post the recording of this webinar on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel this afternoon, and the link will be automatically sent to you through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow. If you have further questions regarding this or other webinars, please email or call me anytime. And again, thank you all for attending, and thank you so much, Brian and Mike, for presenting.
Thank you.
All right.
My pleasure.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.